Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen, I'm a managing editor here at Stratfor, and today I'm joined by our Vice President of Global Analysis, Reva Bhalla, and we'll be talking a little bit about the ongoing Iranian negotiations. So Reva, the negotiations are still ongoing, and surprise, surprise, we haven't had any kind of agreement so far. Where do we actually stand at the moment?
Well, as of now, they're still in talks at the deputy foreign minister level. So it was stepped down from yesterday where we had the foreign ministers in Lausanne. And, it's a worrying prospect because basically now we're looking at potentially a more diluted political agreement coming out that broadly outlines where they've made progress, where there are still some sticking points. And so that leaves a question as to, if the whole intent behind the self-imposed deadline for March was for the president to keep Congress at bay, is this going to be enough to do so? And will that further complicate the 3-month stretch to the June 30th deadline, which is the one that really matters for both Iran and the United States?
Now, we've seen mixed signals here because the Iranians and the Russians have been sounding fairly positive, and yet you've had the British Foreign Minister Philip Hammond saying, well, we've got a framework, but we're not quite there yet. What do you think are the main sticking points? What's really holding up the negotiations themselves?
Well, on one side, it's okay, how do you contain the Iranian nuclear ambitions, right? And so that has several components to it. You can do that by limiting the number of centrifuges that Iran is allowed to maintain operationally, the design of those centrifuges, as some are more advanced than others, and then the amount that's going to be diluted, stockpiled, or shipped out of the country. So all kinds of things in addition to inspections of sensitive facilities in Iran. And so there's a lot of room within all of those components for some give and take. And I think where we hit the snag was basically when Iran said, okay, I'm willing to concede on reducing the number of centrifuges from 10,000, which was the earlier demand by the Supreme Leader, to around 6,000. But we're throwing out this concession on shipping our nuclear fuel out of the country. And so that's a pretty common negotiating tactic, though. When you're in that 11th hour, you throw in that curveball, and then it looks like everything's about to fall apart, but then it can deflect attention from other more sensitive issues and soften up demands along the way. So I'm not particularly surprised that that was tried, and it's holding up the talks at this stage. But, I think the Iranians all along were very set on the June 30th deadline more than anything. And they're very interested in the timeline and pace of how sanctions are actually going to be relieved. And that's a very complicated process.
So perhaps we're seeing Tehran fight a kind of shaping battle in anticipation of what they see as the main event. How realistic do you think it will be that sanctions will get lifted this year, possibly from Iran?
So the sanctions question is a very complicated one, right? So there are multiple players here. On the one hand, the most immediate action you're going to see is when it comes to the UN sanctions. And that's where basically the UN Security Council is going to likely pass some sort of resolution that restates the terms of whatever political agreement comes out of the talks. And that's not really important in terms of trade or energy or anything like that, but it lays an important political foundation for other states to start easing up on Iran. So the Europeans and the big Asian consumers of Iranian energy, that's where they can start to adapt their laws and their policies to allowing more Iranian oil exports, to easing up on the financial and the shipping insurance restrictions on Iran. The United States, on the other hand, is a conundrum when it comes to sanctions. And so really what's going to happen here is the U.S. president is going to have to rely on his waiver authority so he can suspend sanctions for 120-day periods. There's no limit on the number of times that he can extend those waivers. It's not a perfect way to do it, but it's really the only way to do it. In the meantime, he's going to have to show that over a period of at least a year or so, are the Iranians complying? And if so, then maybe we can see the administration try to pass some sort of motion through Congress that calls for a repealing of sanctions. But in an election year, that's obviously going to be very difficult.
Very much so. Now, clearly these negotiations aren't happening in isolation. In the region, we're seeing a lot of instability. We've seen Iranian forces effectively play a part on the ground in Anbar province in Iraq and Saladin province. And currently in Yemen, you have the Saudis taking a very active role in the situation there. How is this affecting the power dynamics in the region from Tehran's point of view?
Well, let's start by looking at this from the Saudi perspective, right? They see a U.S.-Iranian developing rapprochement as inevitable. Regardless of what happens on this deadline or that deadline, they see that relationship developing. And so Saudi is basically taking it upon itself to shoulder more of the burden in the region to say, okay, if the U.S. is not going to be the one that we can rely on to stand up to the Iranians, then we're going to have to assume leadership for that. And that's where we see a very assertive Saudi Arabia pulling together this coalition of partners, which we're learning, a lot of those partners were quite reluctant to even join in that coalition for Yemen. But nonetheless, Saudi money speaks quite loudly for some of these states. And you see the Saudi leadership in the spotlight. From the American point of view, that's a pretty good thing. I mean, the U.S. doesn't want to be in the center of the fight. It is glad to see the regional players, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, to have them be at the center of the conflict and managing the country's crises, however messy they may be.
Very much so. And it'll be interesting to see how the dynamics in the region evolve and how it affects the negotiations building up to inevitable, hopefully, conclusion in June.
Absolutely.
Reva, thank you so much for taking the time to explain this today.
Of course.
For more on this topic and many others, please continue to read stratfor.com.